I invited my family to a luxurious Christmas dinner, but on the day they abandoned me and ate somewhere else. I sat there with tears running down my face until my grandson walked into that restaurant, wet from the snow, and handed me an envelope. As I opened it, that key and DNA test flipped it all. Before I continue, please leave a comment telling us where you are watching from and subscribe to the channel. We are creating a community of people who know that respect is earned, not given. Now back to the story. The flame on the tapered candle was flickering low, dancing against the crystal wine glass that had remained empty for 45 minutes. I sat at the head of a long table draped in white silk linen at Le Ciel, the most exclusive restaurant in the city. The table was set for 12. The finest china, the heavy silver cutlery, the centerpiece of winter roses that cost more than most people's monthly rent. It was 7:30 in the evening on Christmas Eve. The restaurant was humming with the soft murmur of conversations, the clinking of glasses, and the low melody of a live jazz pianist playing a slow rendition of Silent Night. Every other table was full, couples holding hands, families laughing over shared platters, business partners toasting to a profitable year. And then there was me, Ophelia Banks, sitting alone at a table for 12. I am 68 years old, and I did not build a $12 million portfolio by being a woman who lets people pity her. I spent 30 years in investment banking staring down men who thought a black woman belonged in the secretarial pool, not the boardroom. I fought for every inch of ground I stand on. But tonight, as the waiter poured water into my glass for the third time, his eyes held a softness that made my skin crawl. It was pity. Pure, unadulterated pity. "Mrs. Banks," he said, his voice hushed like he was speaking at a funeral. "Would you like us to hold the appetizers a little longer?" I looked at the empty chairs. The 12 empty chairs. My son Derek was supposed to be on my right. My daughter-in-law Courtney on my left. My grandson Liam. The apple of my eye was supposed to be sitting across from me, opening the early Christmas gift I had hidden in my purse, a vintage gold watch. I checked my diamond-encrusted watch. 7:35. They were 35 minutes late. My phone sat on the table, silent and dark. I picked it up, my manicured nails tapping against the screen. No missed calls, no texts. I felt a tightening in my chest, a familiar squeeze that had nothing to do with my heart health and everything to do with a mother's intuition. I opened my messages and started to type. "Where are you?" But before I could hit send, the phone buzzed in my hand. A text from Derek. The preview popped up on the screen and I felt my breath hitch. "Mum, I am so sorry. Courtney has a migraine, a really bad one. She can barely open her eyes. We cannot make it tonight. The lights and noise would be too much for her. We are just going to order pizza and stay quiet at home. You go ahead and eat. Do not wait for us. Love you." I stared at the words. A migraine. Courtney had a migraine. My daughter-in-law, who had spent the last 3 weeks talking about how much she wanted to try the lobster thermidor at Le Ciel, suddenly had a migraine on Christmas Eve. I felt a flash of worry. Maybe it was true. Courtney was delicate, or at least she liked to pretend she was. Whenever there was work to be done or a difficult conversation to be had, she developed a headache or a dizzy spell. But this was Christmas. Surely she would push through for family. I started to type back, telling him I would bring food to them, that I would come over and help with Liam. But something stopped me. A gut feeling honed by decades of reading market fluctuations and spotting liars in business suits. I closed the messaging app and opened Instagram. I am 68, not dead. I know how to use technology. I follow my son. I follow my daughter-in-law. I tapped on Courtney's profile circle, indicating a new story posted 5 minutes ago. The video loaded. My heart stopped beating. It wasn't a dark room. It wasn't a woman lying in bed with a cold compress on her head. It was a party. A loud, bright, luxurious party. The camera panned across a living room I recognized instantly. It was Courtney's parents' house in the suburbs. There was a roaring fire in the fireplace. There was a table laden with food, roast turkey glazed ham, and yes, lobster. And there in the center of the frame, holding a glass of champagne and laughing with her head thrown back, was Courtney. She looked radiant. She was wearing a red velvet dress I had bought her last month. No migraine, no pain, just pure joy. The camera moved, and I saw Derek, my son, my only child, clinking glasses with Courtney's father. And there was Liam, my grandson, sitting on the floor opening presents, tearing into a box that looked suspiciously like the gaming console he had begged me for. The caption across the bottom of the video read, "Christmas peace with the people who actually matter. No toxic energy this year. Blessed, real family." The phone almost slipped from my hand. Toxic energy. That was me. I was the toxic energy. I sat there in the middle of the five-star restaurant, frozen. The humiliation washed over me, hot and suffocating. They hadn't cancelled because of a migraine. They had cancelled because they didn't want to be with me. They had lied to me, left me sitting here alone, waiting like a fool while they celebrated with her family. With the white family that had never truly accepted Derek, but tolerated him because he came with my money attached. My mind flashed back to last week. The memory hit me with the force of a physical blow, explaining everything. Courtney had come to my house, her eyes wide and innocent, asking for an advance on the inheritance. Just $200,000, Ophelia, she had said. There is this amazing investment opportunity in real estate. Derek thinks it is a sure thing. I had looked at the papers she brought. It wasn't an investment, it was a scheme, a house-flipping project managed by a man who had 2 bankruptcies on his record. I had told her no. I had told her that the trust fund was locked until Derek turned 45, and that I would not release liquid cash for a high-risk gamble. She had cried. She had called me controlling. She had said I used my money to hold them hostage. Derek had stood there silent as always, letting his wife berate his mother. And now here was my punishment. This was their revenge. They were showing me that if I did not pay up, I did not get to be part of the family. They were withholding my son and my grandson to teach me a lesson. I looked up and caught the waiter staring at me again. He took a step forward, reaching for the empty wine glass. "Ma'am, is your party arriving soon, or should we?" I cut him off. My voice was steady, even though my hands were shaking under the table. "They are not coming." His face fell. "Oh, I am so sorry. Would you like to order something to take away?" "No," I said. I straightened my spine. I sat up taller. I adjusted the silk scarf around my neck. I did not survive the cutthroat world of finance to be broken by a spoiled girl and a weak man. I looked the waiter in the eye. "Bring me the wine list, the reserve list, and bring me the Wagyu steak, medium rare. You are expecting someone else." "No, I am eating alone, and I am going to enjoy every bite." He nodded, respecting the tone in my voice, and scurried away. I sat there alone, surrounded by the empty chairs that represented the empty promises of my family. I took a sip of water and let the anger burn through the sadness. They thought this would break me. They thought I would call them crying, begging to come over, promising to write the check if they just let me see Liam. They thought I was a lonely old woman desperate for their scraps of affection. They were wrong. I was Ophelia Banks, and tonight I was going to start rewriting my will. But as I picked up the knife to cut into the steak that had just arrived, the front door of the restaurant burst open. A gust of freezing wind swept through the room, making the candle flames dance violently. Heads turned, people frowned. Standing in the doorway was a figure that did not belong in Le Ciel. A young man soaked to the bone, his cheap denim jacket dark with melted snow, his sneakers leaving wet, muddy prints on the pristine marble floor. He was breathing hard, his chest heaving like he had run for miles. His hair was plastered to his forehead, and he was shivering. The manager immediately stepped forward. His hand raised. "Sir, you cannot be in here. Not be in. This is a private establishment. You need to leave." The boy ignored him. His eyes scanned the room, frantic, desperate, until they locked onto me. Dante. My heart stopped for a second time that night. It was Dante. Derek's son from his first marriage, the grandson I hadn't seen in 3 years because Courtney had slowly, methodically pushed him out of our lives. She had called him troubled. She had said he was a bad influence on Liam. She had convinced Derek to send him to live with his mother's sister in a rough part of the city, miles away from our gated community. I had let it happen. God forgive me, I had let it happen to keep the peace. He looked so much like his father used to look before the softness of money made Derek weak. But Dante's eyes were sharp, terrified. "Grandma!" He shouted, his voice cracking. The manager grabbed his arm. "Sir, I am calling the police." I stood up so fast my chair scraped loudly against the floor, silencing the jazz pianist. "Let him go," my voice boomed across the restaurant. "That is my grandson." I walked toward him, ignoring the stares of the other diners. Dante was shaking not just from the cold, but from adrenaline. I reached out and touched his freezing face. "Dante, what are you doing here? Why aren't you?" "Grandma, you have to listen to me." He gasped, gripping my hand with ice-cold fingers. "They aren't just eating dinner at Courtney's parents' house." I froze. "You know, I saw the post too, Grandma, but that is not all. They aren't just ignoring you. They are at your house right now." "My house." "But the post, the video, it is a distraction, Grandma." Dante's words came out in a rush. "They posted that video an hour ago, but it was recorded earlier. I went by your house to leave a card in your mailbox because I didn't have money for a gift. I saw Dad's car around the back. The lights were off, but I saw flashlights inside. They are in your office, Grandma. They are tearing the walls apart." My blood ran cold. My office. The wall safe. The hidden compartment behind the portrait of my late husband Bernard. That was where I kept the bearer bonds, the deeds, and the original trust documents. Courtney was screaming at him. Dante continued, his voice lowering to a whisper. I heard her through the window. She was screaming at Dad to find the new trust amendment before you filed it. She said you were too old and you needed to die soon so they could stop pretending. The room seemed to tilt. My son. My own flesh and blood was breaking into my home on Christmas Eve, looking for documents to steal my fortune while I sat here waiting for them to eat turkey. Dante reached into the inside pocket of his soaked jacket. He pulled out a thick, heavy envelope, sealed with red wax. The edges were singed as if it had been close to a fire. Dad found this in Grandpa's old toolbox in the garage before they went inside the house, Dante said. He was going to burn it. He had the lighter in his hand. He said it was trash from the past. But I saw Grandpa's handwriting. I snatched it. And I ran. I ran all the way here, Grandma. I didn't have money for the bus. I took the envelope. My hands were trembling. I recognized the handwriting immediately. It was Bernard's. My husband, who had passed away 5 years ago. The wax seal was unbroken. On the front, in Bernard's sprawling script, were the words, "To Ophelia. Open only if you question their loyalty." I looked at Dante. He was shivering, blue-lipped, but standing tall, protecting me when his own father was robbing me. I looked at the envelope. Bernard had known. Even from the grave, he had known this day would come. I stared at the thick, yellowed envelope in my hands, feeling the rough texture of the paper against my manicured fingertips. The edges were charred black and flaking away where the fire had touched them, giving off the faint, acrid scent of burnt paper that clashed with the smell of expensive steak and perfume in the restaurant. It felt heavy, heavier than just paper should feel. Dante was watching me, his chest still heaving from his run, his eyes wide and fearful, as if he had just stolen fire from the gods. He told me that he had found it in the bottom of his grandfather's old rusty toolbox, the one place my son Derek never bothered to look until tonight. He said my son was standing over the trash can in the garage with a lighter in his hand, ready to destroy the past to protect his future. Dante had lunged for it, burning his own fingers to snatch it from the flames because he recognized the handwriting. I traced the ink on the front of the envelope. It was fading, but unmistakably Bernard's. My husband. The man who had built this empire with me brick by brick. The script was sharp and angular, just like him. To Ophelia. Open only if you question their loyalty. My breath hitched in my throat. Bernard had been gone for 5 years. Yet here he was reaching out from the grave, handing me a weapon he had forged in secret. He knew, even back then he knew that this day might come. With trembling fingers, I broke the wax seal. It cracked with a dry snap that sounded too loud in the quiet luxury of the dining room. I tipped the envelope over, and 3 things slid out onto the pristine white tablecloth. First was a key. It was not a house key or a car key. It was a sleek, heavy, black magnetic card key, with no markings other than a small gold chip. I recognized it immediately. It was for a private, high-security vault at the Swiss bank where I used to be a director, a vault that did not exist on any of our family ledgers. Second was a folded letter written on Bernard's personal stationery. And third was a document stapled together with a medical logo at the top. I picked up the letter first. My eyes scanned Bernard's familiar scrawl, and I could almost hear his deep, gravelly voice reading the words to me. My dearest Ophelia, if you are reading this, then my heart has failed me before I could find the courage to break yours. I have suspected Courtney since the beginning. She is a viper, Ophelia, and she does not love our son. I noticed how she looked at her tennis instructor, how she took phone calls in the garden late at night. I needed to be sure. I took a sample of Liam's hair from his hairbrush 3 months ago. I am sorry I did this without you, but I had to protect our legacy. My hands shook so hard the paper rattled. I dropped the letter and picked up the medical document. It was a DNA paternity test, dated 5 years ago, just weeks before Bernard died. I skipped the technical jargon and looked at the bottom of the page where the results were printed in bold black ink. Alleged father Derek Banks, child Liam Banks, probability of paternity 0%. The room spun. The sounds of the restaurant faded into a dull roar. Liam, the golden child, the grandson. I had spoiled the boy. I had set up a trust fund for the child Courtney used as a pawn to demand money and attention. He wasn't ours. He wasn't a Banks. He didn't have a drop of my husband's blood in his veins. I looked at the date on the report again. Bernard had received this result 2 days before his massive stroke. The realization hit me like a physical blow. The shock of this betrayal. The weight of this secret, it might have been the thing that killed him. He had died trying to protect me from this truth, trying to figure out how to tell me that our lineage had been hijacked by a woman who only wanted our millions. I looked up at Dante, my real grandson. The boy sitting across from me, shivering in a wet jacket, the boy who had been cast aside and treated like a second-class citizen in favor of a child who was a lie. Dante was the only one, the only blood we had left. The only one who had proven his loyalty, not by asking for money, but by running through the snow to save me. I reached out and covered Dante's cold hand with mine. The tears I had been holding back evaporated instantly, replaced by a cold clarity that felt like armor. I picked up the black magnetic key and closed my fist around it. It was cold and hard, and it felt like justice. "Eat your steak, Dante," I said, my voice steady and low. "We are going to need our strength. Tonight we are not just fighting for money, we are fighting for your grandfather." I watched Dante devour the steak in 5 minutes like a starving wolf before we walked out into the winter night. My driver held the door of the Bentley open, his face carefully neutral, despite the mud on Dante's sneakers. Most grandmothers would have driven straight home to confront the thieves tearing apart their walls. But I did not build a dynasty by acting on impulse. To go home now would be to walk into a crime scene without a weapon. I needed ammunition. I told my driver to take us downtown to the Sovereign Private Bank building. I had not stepped foot inside those marble halls since I retired as director 3 years ago. But influence does not expire like a gym membership. The night manager turned pale when he saw me striding through the lobby at 10 o'clock on Christmas Eve, with a soaking wet teenager in tow. "Mrs. Banks," he stammered, trying to block my path. "The vault is closed for the holiday." I didn't even slow down. I looked him dead in the eye and told him that if he didn't open the platinum-level security gate in 30 seconds, I would make one phone call to the chairman of the board and have him working the drive-through window by morning. He opened the gate. We took the private elevator down into the silence of the subterranean vault. The air was cool and smelled of old money and secrets. I walked straight to box number 409, the number etched on the back of the black magnetic key Bernard had left me. My hand was steady as I inserted the key. The mechanism clicked, a sound that echoed like a gunshot in the quiet room. I pulled the heavy steel drawer open. Inside there were no diamonds, there were no gold bars, there was just paper. Stacks and stacks of documents held together with rubber bands. Bernard's final gift. It was a forensic accounting of our destruction. I pulled out the files and spread them on the viewing table. Dante stood beside me, his eyes widening as he looked at the rows of numbers. Bernard had been busy before he died. He had hired forensic accountants to track every penny that moved through our family accounts. I picked up a file labeled CM Ventures. It looked like a standard consulting firm, the kind of boring expense usually written off as overhead. But as I turned the pages, the truth began to bleed through the ink. Courtney had set up this shell company 8 years ago, right after she married my son. I traced the lines of transactions. Every month for 8 years, transfers were made from my son's joint account into CM Ventures. 3,000 here, 5,000 there. Sometimes 10,000 labeled as home renovations or business consulting fees. It was a slow, steady drip of theft, designed to be invisible to a husband who never checked the fine print. But Bernard had checked. He had followed the money trail all the way to the bottom. The documents showed that CM Ventures was not a business. It was a funnel. The money flowed out of my son's account and straight into an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. And the name on that offshore account was not Courtney's. It was Thomas Miller. I stared at the name. Thomas Miller. I recognized it from old stories Courtney used to tell. He was her high school sweetheart, the one who got away, the one she claimed she had lost touch with years ago, the father of her child. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. My son Derek had been unknowingly sending thousands of dollars a month to his wife's lover. I flipped to the summary page at the back of the file. The total amount transferred over 8 years was circled in red ink, $2.5 million. I felt a wave of nausea roll through me. $2.5 million of my hard-earned money, of the wealth I had built to protect my family, had been stolen to fund the lifestyle of a man who was sleeping with my daughter-in-law. And Derek, my foolish blind son, had signed off on every single transfer. He was so desperate to keep her happy, so desperate to be accepted by her and her family, that he had let her bleed him dry without ever asking where the blood was going. He thought he was investing in their future, but he was just paying for her past. Dante looked at the number on the page, and then looked at me, his face pale. "Grandma," he whispered, "Dad doesn't know. He really doesn't know." "No," I said, my voice cold and sharp as cut glass. "Your father doesn't know anything. He is a man who thinks love can be bought, and he has paid the highest price for a counterfeit product." I gathered the papers, my movements precise and angry. I shoved the evidence into my alligator skin bag. We had the DNA test proving Liam was a lie. We had the bank records proving the theft. We had the key to the truth. I looked at Dante. He was no longer just a shivering boy. He was my witness. He was my partner. "Come on, Dante," I said, snapping the bag shut. "We have enough to bury them. Now we just need to dig the grave." We sat in the back of my Bentley, parked 3 streets away from my own home, shrouded in the darkness of Christmas Eve. I felt like a spy in a cheap thriller, watching Dante pull a battered laptop from his backpack. He didn't need to break into the system because he was the one who had built it. Years ago, before Courtney had fully succeeded in banishing him from our lives, Dante had installed my entire home security network. He typed a few commands, his fingers flying across the keyboard with a precision that reminded me of his grandfather, and then he turned the screen toward me. The grainy blue light of the monitor illuminated a scene of absolute violation. My study, the sanctuary where I had negotiated mergers and planned my family's future, was being torn apart. My son Derek was sweating through his expensive cashmere sweater, swinging a heavy sledgehammer into the plaster wall behind my mahogany desk. He looked desperate and pathetic, his eyes wild as he struck the wall again and again. But it was Courtney who commanded the scene. She was pacing back and forth like a caged tiger, still wearing that red velvet dress, holding a glass of my vintage wine in one hand and pointing aggressively with the other. Dante pressed a button to unmute the audio feed, and Courtney's voice screeched through the speakers, sharp and distorted but unmistakably cruel. "Hit it harder, Derek," she screamed, her face twisted into a mask of greed. "Stop being so weak." That old hag definitely hid the trust certificates in the wall safe behind the painting. I know she did. We need those bearer bonds before she realizes we aren't coming to dinner. Derek paused for a moment, wiping dust and sweat from his forehead, his chest heaving. He looked at the camera lens for a split second, not knowing we were watching him. "But what about Dante?" he asked, his voice shaking. "Even if we get the bonds, if Mum dies, he is still a legal heir. The law says he gets a share." Courtney laughed, a sound that was cold enough to freeze the blood in my veins. She took a sip of my wine and sneered at her husband. "Forget about that little mistake," she hissed. "I have a plan for him. Once we secure the assets, we will plant some of my diamond jewelry in his backpack. We will call the police and say he broke in and stole it. 1 felony charge is all it takes to invalidate his claim to the trust. He will go to juvenile detention where he belongs, and I am not splitting a single cent of my money with your charity case son." The air vanished from the car. I looked at Dante. He was staring at the screen, his face devoid of color, his eyes wide with the crushing realization that his stepmother was plotting to send him to prison, and his father was saying absolutely nothing to stop her. He didn't speak, but a single tear rolled down his cheek, landing on the keyboard. That tear was the final straw. They could steal my money. They could destroy my home. They could lie to my face. But planning to frame my grandson to ruin his young life just to keep an extra percentage of wealth that they didn't earn, that was unforgivable. That was a declaration of war. I reached out and grabbed Dante's hand, squeezing it tight enough to anchor us both to the earth. The trembling in my own body stopped, replaced by a calm so profound it felt like the eye of a hurricane. I looked at my grandson, and for the first time that night I smiled. It was not a nice smile. It was the smile I wore when I was about to acquire a rival company and strip it for parts. "Do not worry, child," I whispered, my eyes never leaving the image of my son destroying his own inheritance. "You are not going to prison. But tonight, I am going to teach them a lesson in finance that they will never forget. Drive on, Dante. We have a party to crash." Christmas morning dawned bright and cold, but the warmth in my chest had nothing to do with the season, and everything to do with the trap I was about to spring. I sat in my favorite armchair by the window, the one overlooking the snowy garden, and picked up the phone. I took a deep breath, closed my eyes, and summoned every ounce of vulnerability I had buried 30 years ago. When I entered the shark tank of investment banking, I needed to sound frail. I needed to sound broken. I needed to sound like a mother who was terrified of dying alone. I dialed Derek's number. He answered on the second ring, his voice guarded and suspicious. "Derek. Baby. It is Mum." I let my voice waver, letting a little tremor seep into the words. "I am so sorry about last night. I did not mean to get so upset. I was just confused. You know how my mind gets sometimes. I spent the whole night thinking. And I realized you are right. I am too old to manage this estate by myself. It is too much pressure, and I am so lonely in this big house." There was a pause on the other end, and then I heard the muffled sound of Derek whispering to Courtney. When he came back on the line, his voice was smooth, dripping with fake concern. "Mum, do not apologize. We were just worried about you. We know it is a lot for you to handle." "I know, son." I continued, twisting the knife of my own deception. "I have made a decision. I do not want to fight anymore. I want to transfer everything to you. The house, the portfolio, the control of the family trust. I want to sign it all over to you and Courtney at the New Year's Eve party. I want to start the new year with a clean slate." I could practically hear the greed radiating through the phone line. I heard Courtney gasp in the background, a sharp intake of breath that sounded like a predator spotting a wounded animal. "That sounds like a wonderful idea," Mom, Derek said, trying to keep his voice steady, but failing. "We will come over right now. We will bring flowers. We can spend Christmas together like a real family." They arrived 45 minutes later. They must have driven like maniacs, terrified that I would change my mind if they took too long. Derek walked in first, holding a massive bouquet of overpriced roses that he had probably bought at a gas station. Courtney followed him, her face arranged into a mask of sympathy that was so thick it looked painful. They had evidently spent the morning frantically cleaning up the mess they had made in my study. I noticed the smell of fresh plaster and paint where they had hastily patched the holes in the wall. It was a sloppy job, but I pretended not to notice. "Oh, Mum," Courtney cooed, rushing over to hug me. She smelled of expensive perfume and deception. "We were so scared for you. We just want what is best for the family." I hugged her back, my body stiff, but my face smiling. "I know, dear," I said, patting her hand. "I know. And to show you how much I appreciate you taking on this burden, I have a gift for you." I reached into my pocket and pulled out a velvet box. Inside was a diamond necklace, or at least that is what it looked like. It was a high-grade cubic zirconia replica of a piece I had sold years ago. I had bought it for $200 at a costume jewelry shop to test the lighting in my safe deposit box. But to an untrained eye, blinded by avarice, it looked like $50,000. For the new matriarch of the Banks family, I said, handing it to her. Courtney's eyes all bulged. She snatched the box, her hands trembling not with gratitude, but with the thrill of acquisition. "Oh, Ophelia, it is stunning," she breathed, clasping it around her neck. "I will wear it to the New Year's Eve party. It is perfect." They stayed for an hour, eating my cookies, drinking my coffee, talking about their big plans for the estate. Courtney was already mentally redecorating the living room, talking about knocking down walls and modernizing the space. Derek was talking about which cars he was going to buy. They looked at me with pity, thinking I was a senile old woman who had finally surrendered. They had no idea that the woman sitting across from them was not a victim, but an executioner. As soon as they left, the smile dropped from my face like a stone. I walked to the window and watched their car disappear down the driveway. Then I picked up the phone again. This time, I did not call my son. I called my lawyer. "Get the paperwork ready," I told him, my voice back to its steel, hard normal. "We are executing the nuclear option." For the next 5 days, I worked in the shadows. While Derek and Courtney were busy planning their victory lap, I was busy digging the ground out from under them. I met with my private investigator in a diner 3 towns over. He handed me a dossier on Thomas Miller. It was thick. It contained photos, addresses, and a current phone number. Thomas Miller, the man Courtney had been funneling my money to, the man whose DNA was woven into the child my son was raising. I called him personally. I did not tell him who I was or why I was calling. I simply told him that I was an investor who represented a silent partner interested in his business ventures, and that his presence was requested at an exclusive gala on New Year's Eve. I hinted that a check for $2.5 million might be waiting for him if he attended. Greed is a universal language, and Thomas Miller spoke it fluently. He agreed to come. Then came the final step, the most important signature of my life. I sat in my lawyer's office, the heavy mahogany desk covered in legal documents. These were not the transfer papers Derek thought I was signing. These were the documents for an irrevocable trust. I picked up the pen. With a few strokes of black ink, I transferred ownership of the estate, the investment portfolio, the liquid assets, and the future of the Banks dynasty. $12 million. Gone from my name. Gone from Derek's potential inheritance. Locked away in a fortress of legal jargon that no judge in this country could break. And on the line for sole beneficiary, I wrote a single name. Dante Banks. I put the pen down and looked at my lawyer. "Is it done?" "It is ironclad, Ophelia," he said, closing the folder. "As soon as the ball drops on New Year's Eve, Dante is the wealthiest teenager in the state. And your son is a pauper." I nodded. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city skyline. The stage was set. The players were in position. My son thought he was coming to a coronation. He did not know he was walking into a massacre. New Year's Eve at the Banks estate was usually an affair of understated elegance, but tonight it reeked of new money and desperation. The ballroom was filled with the city's elite business partners I had known for decades, and socialites who could smell a scandal from a mile away. Courtney was floating through the crowd like she already owned the place. She was wearing a custom $10,000 emerald silk gown that hugged her body a dress. She had charged to my credit card that morning, assuming I would never see the bill. The fake diamond necklace I had given her glittered around her neck, a perfect symbol of her fraudulent life. I watched from the shadows as she snapped her fingers at my longtime house manager, ordering him to refill the champagne tower with a tone of voice one uses for a disobedient dog. She was radiant with greed. Across the room, Derek was holding court with a group of my investors. He was already drunk on expensive scotch and premature power. I could hear him bragging, his voice carrying over the string quartet, about the new aggressive investment strategy he planned to implement as soon as the clock struck 12. He was selling a future he did not own to people who were too polite to tell him he was a fool. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 10. It was time. I walked to the small stage set up at the front of the room. The microphone hummed as I tapped it, and the sound cut through the chatter like a knife. The room fell silent. All eyes turned to me. Courtney stopped mid-laugh, her eyes narrowing slightly before she pasted on that mask of dutiful concern. Derek raised his glass to me, a sloppy toast to his own impending victory. "Welcome, everyone," I said, my voice warm and welcoming, the perfect hostess. "Thank you for celebrating with us tonight. As you all know, I have made a decision to step down and pass the torch of the bank's legacy to the next generation." Applause rippled through the room. Courtney squeezed Derek's hand, her knuckles white. But before I signed the transfer papers, I continued. "I have prepared a special presentation. A gift, really. I wanted to share a moment of truth with the family that means so much to me. A look back at the memories that brought us here." I gestured to the massive projection screen behind me. Courtney beamed, looking expecting a montage of flattering photos that would cement her status as the new matriarch. Derek looked smug. I pressed the button on the remote. The screen did not show a family portrait. It flickered with the grainy blue light of a security camera feed. The date stamp in the corner read December 24th. A collective gasp went through the room as the image sharpened. It was my study. The audio feed kicked in loud and distorted, but crystal clear. The sound of a sledgehammer smashing into plaster echoed through the ballroom, making the guests jump. On the screen, a woman in a red dress was pacing back and forth, screaming. It was Courtney. Her face was twisted into a snarl that made her look demonic. "Break the wall faster, Derek," she shrieked. "That stingy old black hag hid the bonds in there, I know she did. We need to find them before she dies, so we do not have to pay taxes." The silence in the ballroom was absolute. It was a vacuum. Courtney's face drained of all color. She stood frozen, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. On the screen, Derek swung the hammer again. "I hate this house," he grunted. "As soon as she signs it over, I am burning this room down. I am putting her in the cheapest home I can find. She has controlled us long enough." I watched the faces of my friends and colleagues. Their shock was turning into horror. They looked from the screen to the man standing in their midst, holding a glass of scotch. Derek looked like he was going to be sick. But I was not done. I clicked the remote again. The video vanished, replaced by a spreadsheet. It was a forensic bank statement blown up to the size of a billboard. Rows and rows of highlighted transactions appeared. The source account was Derek and Courtney's joint checking. The destination was an offshore entity, but I had highlighted the beneficial owner of that offshore account. The name Thomas Miller glowed in bright red letters. The crowd murmured. They saw the numbers. $2.5 million siphoned away over 8 years. "Who is Thomas Miller?" Someone whispered loudly near the front. I clicked the remote one last time. The final image appeared. It was a medical document, simple and stark. A DNA paternity test. On the left was a photo of my son, Derek. On the right was a photo of my grandson, Liam. And in the center was a photo of a man with pale skin and light eyes. a man who looked exactly like Liam, Thomas Miller. The text at the bottom of the screen was magnified, so even the people in the back could read it. Probability of paternity 0%. The ballroom erupted. It was not a murmur anymore. It was a roar of shock and scandal. Derek dropped his glass. It shattered on the floor, the sound lost in the chaos. He stared at the screen, his eyes bulging. He looked at the photo of Thomas Miller. He looked at the bank statement showing he had paid millions to his wife's lover. And then he looked at Courtney. Courtney let out a sound that was not human. It was a screech of pure, cornered animal panic. "Turn it off!" she screamed, lunging toward the stage, her $10,000 dress tangling around her legs. "You are crazy. It is all fake." But it was too late. The truth was 40 feet high and impossible to ignore. My son stood alone in the center of the room, destroyed not by me, but by the secrets I had simply turned the lights on. "Turn it off!" Courtney shrieked, her voice cracking into a hysterical falsetto that grated against the ears of every socialite in the room. She lunged toward the projector, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated panic as she clawed at the air. "You are insane!" she screamed, spinning around to face the crowd with wild eyes. "This is all fake. She fabricated everything because she is senile and jealous. Do not believe her." I did not flinch. I did not shout back. I simply raised my right hand in a small, sharp gesture. It was the signal. From the shadows of the catering entrance, a man stepped into the light. He was wearing a tuxedo I had paid for, and his eyes were darting nervously around the room. But he walked forward, just as we had agreed. Thomas Miller. The moment he stepped onto the ballroom floor, the air left the room. But it was not the adults who reacted first. It was the child. Liam, the boy. I had bought Christmas presents for the boy I had bounced on my knee. The boy my son had raised as his own flesh and blood let out a squeal of pure delight. "Uncle Tommy." He shouted, his voice echoing in the stunned silence. Liam broke away from the nanny and ran across the polished floor. He ran right past Derek. He ran past his mother. He threw his small arms around Thomas Miller's legs and hugged him tight. "You came to the party, Uncle Tommy," he beamed, looking up at the man with total adoration. "You said you were going to be a secret surprise." That hug was louder than any gunshot. It was the undeniable proof that shattered the last of Derek's delusions. Thomas Miller had not just been a name on a bank statement. He had been there all along, in their house, in their lives, playing father while my son was at work, earning the money to support them all. Derek made a sound that I will never forget. It was a low, guttural moan of a man whose soul was being ripped out. He looked at his wife, who was now frozen in horror. He looked at the boy he loved hugging a stranger. And then he looked at me, the mother he had betrayed, the mother he had tried to rob, the mother who had just saved him from living a lie for the rest of his life. His legs gave out. He did not faint. He just collapsed, sinking to his knees on the ballroom floor, as if the weight of his own stupidity was too heavy to bear. But the night was not over. As the guests whispered and gasped, the double doors at the back of the room swung open with authority. 4 men and 2 women in dark suits entered the room. They moved with the precision of predators. It was not the local police. It was the Economic Crimes Unit. I had called them 3 hours ago. They marched straight past my weeping son. They flanked Courtney, who was now trembling so hard her diamond necklace was shaking. Courtney Banks, the lead officer, announced, his voice cutting through the sobbing. "You are under arrest for embezzlement, wire fraud, and money laundering." She tried to run. It was pathetic, really. She took 2 steps in her heels before they grabbed her. The click of the handcuffs snapping around her wrists was the most satisfying sound I had heard in years. She screamed, thrashing against the officers. "Derek, do something," she wailed, desperation clawing at her throat. "Help me. Tell them it was a mistake." Derek did not even look up. Two other officers moved toward Thomas Miller. He tried to pull away from Liam, but they grabbed him. "You are also under arrest, Mr. Miller, for conspiracy to commit fraud and receipt of stolen funds." As they dragged them both away, kicking and screaming past the shocked faces of the city's elite, I looked down at my son. The police did not touch him. Being a fool is not a crime. Being weak is not a felony. He was not going to prison, but as he knelt there alone in the center of the ruin of his life, watching his wife and the real father of his child get hauled away in handcuffs, he looked like a man who had just received a life sentence. I stood on the stage, looking down at the wreckage. I felt no guilt. I felt no regret. I simply felt the cold, hard satisfaction of a ledger finally being balanced. When the police cars finally faded into the night, and the last of the scandalized guests scurried away like rats fleeing a sinking ship, the ballroom felt cavernous and cold. The only sound was the weeping of a grown man, Derek. My only son crawled across the polished floor until he was at my feet. He reached for the hem of my dress, his hands shaking violently, but I took a step back, moving out of his reach. He looked up at me, his face streaked with tears and snot, a portrait of absolute ruin. "Mum," he choked out, "please. I am sorry, I did not know. She tricked me. Please do not cut me off. I have nothing." I looked down at him. For a moment I did not see the 42-year-old man who had tried to rob me. I saw the little boy I had held when he scraped his knee, the teenager I had taught to drive. My heart broke one last time, shattering into dust, but my face remained as hard as granite. "I am not going to send you to prison, Derek," I said, my voice echoing in the empty room. "Not because I forgive you, but because you carry the name Banks, and I will not have my husband's name dragged through a criminal trial any more than it already has been." Hope flared in his eyes, a pathetic, desperate flicker. "Thank you, Mum, thank you." "I knew you would." "Stop." I cut him off sharp as a whip. "I am not sending you to prison, but you are no longer my son. You made your choice. You chose a family of liars and thieves over the mother who built the world you lived in. I respect your decision to leave this family." I walked over to the small table where my lawyer had left the final documents. I picked up a check. It was for $5,000. "This is for you," I said, dropping the check onto the floor in front of him. "It is a monthly allowance. It is enough to rent a small apartment and buy groceries so you do not starve. But that is it. The trust is gone. The inheritance is gone. You will never step foot in this house or any of my properties again. Now get out before I change my mind and call the police back." Derek stared at the check on the floor. He looked at me, waiting for the punchline, waiting for me to tell him it was a lesson and he could come home. But he saw only ice in my eyes. He grabbed the check, scrambled to his feet, and ran out the door into the snow without looking back. I let out a breath. I felt like I had been holding for 20 years. The air in the room instantly felt lighter, cleaner. I turned toward the corner of the room where Dante was standing. He had been silent through it all, watching with wide eyes, his arms wrapped around himself. He looked ready to bolt, ready to disappear back into the night, now that the show was over. "Dante, come here." He walked toward me, hesitant and shy. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the master key to the estate, the heavy iron key that opened the front gates and the front door. I took his hand and pressed the metal into his palm, folding his fingers over it. Then I handed him the thick leather binder containing the irrevocable trust. You are the only one who never asked me for a dime. I told him, my voice softening for the first time that night. You ran through the snow to save me with nothing to gain but my safety. That makes you the only person in this world worthy of holding this burden. Dante looked at the key and then at me. But Grandma, I do not know how to run a business. I am just a kid. I smiled and brushed a stray lock of hair from his forehead. You are the head of the Banks family now, Dante, and I am going to teach you everything I know. An hour later, the house was quiet. The staff had cleaned up the broken glass, and the lights in the ballroom were dimmed. Dante and I sat in the library in front of a roaring fire. The warmth seeped into my bones, chasing away the chill of the evening. On the small table between us sat the bottle of vintage wine I had ordered at the restaurant hours ago. I poured 2 glasses. I handed one to Dante and took one for myself. We watched the flames dance in the hearth. The crackling wood, the only sound in the room. It was peaceful. It was real. I took a sip of the wine and looked at my grandson. The boy who had been hidden away. The boy who had been rejected, but who had returned to save the kingdom. You know Dante? I said, staring into the fire. People always talk about blood. They say blood is thicker than water. They say family is everything. But tonight, you taught me the truth. I turned to look at him, his face glowing in the firelight. Blood is not just DNA, Dante. Blood isn't whose name you carry. Blood is the person who is willing to stand in front of the bullet for you. Blood is loyalty when it costs you something. You did that. You are my blood. We clinked glasses and drank to the future, while the snow fell silently outside, burying the past. So that is my story. I kicked my own son out onto the street to protect the legacy for the grandson he threw away. Some people say I am heartless. Some people say a mother should forgive anything. But I say betrayal has a price tag. What do you think? Was I too cruel? Or was this exactly what justice looks like? Let me know in the comments below. Here is the lesson learned from the story. The most profound lesson from Ophelia's journey is the redefining of what family truly means. We are often taught that blood is the ultimate bond, one that demands unconditional forgiveness. However, this story shatters that illusion. Ophelia discovered that DNA is merely biology, but loyalty is a choice. Her own son, despite sharing her blood, viewed her only as a resource to be exploited. In contrast, Dante, the grandson who had been cast aside, demonstrated that true kinship is defined by courage, integrity, and the willingness to protect one another when it matters most. Furthermore, the story serves as a powerful reminder that dignity has no expiration date. Ophelia refused to be the victim of her own generosity. She taught us that setting boundaries is not an act of cruelty. It is an act of self-preservation. We must stop funding those who disrespect us and start investing in those who truly value our presence, not just our assets. Justice is not about revenge. It is about restoring balance and ensuring that a legacy is passed to hands worthy of holding it. If you were in Ophelia's shoes, would you have left the door open for your son to return, or did he deserve to lose everything? Let me know in the comments below.